Some men gamble with cards, some gamble with their lives. Me? I did both. But I never thought I'd bet my heart on a losing hand, until I found my wife in another man's arms. Name's Russell McKinney, 48 years old. Spent most of my life in the kind of places where luck can change with the flick of a wrist. Grew up in the backrooms of Vegas casinos, where my old man played cards for a living and taught me everything worth knowing. The odds, the tells, the way a man shifts in his seat when he's bluffing. That's where I learned that everyone's got a game, whether they admit it or not. Some people play for money, some for power, some for love. I run a high-stakes poker game in the back of a jazz club in New Orleans. It's not exactly legal, but it's not the kind of thing the law cracks down on either, at least not unless they're looking for a reason. The right people play at my table. Men who don't like casinos because they don't want cameras watching their every move. Men who need to win big or lose quietly. I deal them cards, keep the drinks flowing, and make sure nobody gets stupid. Pays well. More than well. Keeps my daughter, Lena, in a good school. Gives my niece, Ruby, a home. Keeps the bills paid and the lights on. And it's a damn good life. Or it was. Something had been off with Denise for months. She was always practical, always a little cold. But now there was distance, like she was already halfway out the door. She started working late. Texting with the screen tilted away. And it wasn't just that. There was something different in the way she looked at me. Not with anger or resentment, those I could handle. It was indifference. Like she'd already decided I didn't matter. I let it slide at first. I had too much going on to chase shadows. But then a bank statement showed up with a charge for a hotel I'd never been to. Denise never traveled for work. She barely even liked leaving the house. So I did what any man with half a brain would do. I started watching. Nothing dramatic. No hired detectives or secret cameras. Just patience. The way you wait for a bad hand to fold itself. A week later, she told me she was staying late at the office. I didn't argue. Just kissed Lena goodnight, grabbed my coat, and parked down the street from Denise's building. Watched her walk out at 9 sharp, hair and makeup fresh like she was headed somewhere that mattered. And I followed. The hotel wasn't fancy, but it wasn't a dump either. Just clean enough to feel respectable, just discreet enough to make it easy. I didn't storm in, didn't make a scene, just walked up to the front desk and slid the guy $100. Room number, I said. The kid behind the counter hesitated, but money talks, and I'd been speaking the language longer than he'd been alive. He glanced at the register, then mumbled, 1420. I took the stairs, gave myself time to breathe. What was I expecting? An apology? A look of regret? Some tearful confession? No. I knew Denise. Knew she didn't do guilt. She did calculations. Risk versus reward. And apparently, she'd decided I wasn't worth the bet anymore. The door was cracked open. That told me everything I needed to know. Careless. Comfortable. Not even worried about getting caught. I stepped inside. The TV was on low, casting blue light over the bed. Denise was sitting up against the headboard, hair tousled, wearing a silk robe I hadn't seen in years. And beside her, half-dressed and looking a little too comfortable for my liking, was David Lasky. A lawyer, mid-40s, the kind of guy who played golf on Sundays and thought he was smarter than everyone in the room. Denise saw me first, didn't even flinch, just reached for the nightstand, took a slow sip of water and said, "Well, this is awkward." Lasky? He went pale, stared at me like a deer caught in headlights, then scrambled to sit up. "Russell, listen." I held up a hand. "Don't. Just don't." He shut up. Smart move. Denise exhaled through her nose, like I was the one inconveniencing her. "What do you want, Russell?" I almost laughed. Almost. "Seriously." She rolled her eyes. "If you came here for a dramatic confrontation, I'm going to have to disappoint you." "That's funny," I said. I was just about to say the same thing. She studied me for a second, then nodded, like she'd made some final decision in her head. "So that's it then? You tell me." She sighed and pushed the covers back, standing up like we were just two people having a normal conversation. "It wasn't personal," she said. reaching for a cigarette from the dresser. I snorted. That's so? She lit the cigarette, took a drag, then exhaled. You were never really here, Russell. You spent all your time in that damn club, with your cards and your gamblers and your long nights. I waited for you to notice. You didn't. So I moved on. There it was. The excuse. Like I'd forced her into it. Like she had no choice. I'd seen men try that same line at my table, guys who lost big and blamed the deck. I nodded, slow and easy. Good to know. She hesitated like she expected more. Yelling. Crying. Something. But I wasn't giving her that. I turned to Lasky, who still hadn't moved. You know you're a lawyer, so tell me what's the going rate for screwing another man's wife? He swallowed hard. Russell, I held up a hand again. Relax. I'm not gonna hit you. Not tonight. I leaned in just close enough that he could smell the whiskey on my breath. But I'm not gonna forget either. He nodded, throat bobbing. Denise watched me, unreadable. So what now? I smiled. Yeah? Now I go home. And I did. Didn't slam the door, didn't cause a scene. Just walked out, hands in my pockets, like I'd seen the whole thing coming. Because maybe I had. But that didn't mean I was gonna let it slide. I drove home slow, the kind of slow that wasn't about traffic but about thinking. The streets were quiet, neon lights bleeding into the wet pavement from a drizzle that had come and gone. New Orleans never really slept, but at that hour it took a breath. I let the window down, let the air cut through the heat in my chest. I wasn't angry, not the kind of anger that made men stupid. No, I was something colder. Something settled. When I stepped inside, the house was dark except for the low glow from the kitchen. Ruby was still up, hunched over the table with a book. She glanced up when she heard the door. You're home early, she said, stretching her arms behind her head. Yeah. I loosened my tie, hung my hat on the rack. She squinted at me. You look like hell. Thanks. I grabbed a glass from the cabinet, filled it with water. She tapped her pen against the table. Something happened? I took a long drink. Considered lying. Didn't. Found out Denise's been sleeping with someone else. Ruby didn't look surprised. Just set the pen down, leaning back in her chair. Huh. That's all you got? She shrugged. I mean, she's always been kind of, like that. I smirked. No, I don't know. Enlighten me. She's cold, Russell. You know that. She always talks like she's got one foot out the door. I'm surprised it took this long. I exhaled through my nose, sat across from her. Lena asleep? Out cold. Good. Last thing I needed was my daughter waking up in the middle of this. Ruby studied me, head tilted slightly. You gonna do something about it? Oh yeah, I said, rolling my shoulders. Just gotta decide how. She grinned. Can I help? I laughed, shaking my head. Not this time, kid. She shrugged, going back to her book like it was just another night. That's what I liked about Ruby. She didn't do dramatics. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my chin. I'd seen enough men get cheated on to know how this usually went. Some fell apart, let the pain drag them through the mud. Some lashed out, did something stupid that got them locked up or dead. Me? I wasn't in the business of losing. If Denise thought she could play me for a fool, then she didn't know me as well as she thought. Next morning, I got dressed slow, took my time. Well-worn suit, hat pulled low, the usual. I went down to the club early, made a couple calls, put things in motion. Then, around noon, I walked into Denise's office. The receptionist barely looked up from her computer. She knew me, knew better than to stop me. I pushed through the glass doors and stepped inside. Denise was sitting behind her desk, neat and polished like nothing in her world had changed. She glanced up, barely blinking. Russell. Denise. She leaned back, crossed one leg over the other. I assume you're here to talk about last night. I tossed a manila folder onto her desk. She flicked it open. Hotel receipts. Text logs. Pictures. Everything. She exhaled slowly, closed it, set it aside. All right. That's all you got to say? What do you want me to say? I pulled out a chair, sat across from her, keeping my hands folded on my knee. I want you to tell me why you did it. And don't give me the you were never around speech. I want the truth. She studied me for a long moment, then nodded slightly. Okay. She leaned forward, elbows on the desk. I did it because I wanted to. Because I could. Because you were so caught up in your own world, I realized I didn't have to answer to anyone. I let the silence settle between us. Then I smiled. Not a warm smile. A gambler's smile. The kind that made men nervous. Well, I said, standing up, adjusting my cuffs. That makes this easier. She raised an eyebrow. What does? I stepped toward the door, pausing just long enough to glance back. You'll see. I left without another word, walked past the receptionist, out into the sun. I wasn't done with Denise. Not by a long shot. But if she thought she could control how this ended, she had another thing coming. I didn't rush. Rushing is for men who panic, and I don't panic. I let the hours stretch, spent the afternoon at the club, dealing cards, watching the usual faces come and go. Men who gambled with more than just money. Men who thought they were untouchable until they weren't. I'd seen enough of them crash and burn to know one thing: everybody has a weakness. You just have to know where to press. Denise's was easy. Reputation. She liked to act like she didn't care what people thought, but she did. She'd spent years building this careful, polished image, the respectable wife, the competent professional, the woman who always had it together. The truth? She was just like every other player at my table, bluffing her way through life. And I was about to call it. By the time the sun started dipping low, I had everything I needed. Denise thought she'd pulled off the perfect affair, quiet, controlled, no strings attached. But she hadn't counted on the fact that I know people. The kind of people who know how to dig. It hadn't taken long to find out that David Lasky wasn't just some bored married man looking for a side piece. He had secrets of his own. Dirty ones. The kind that could end a career. And Denise? Well, she'd hitched her wagon to a sinking ship without even realizing it. I made one last call, then grabbed my coat and stepped out into the humid New Orleans evening. Lasky had a routine. A boring one. He left his office at 6 sharp, stopped by the same bar for a drink, then drove straight home to his wife, pretending like he wasn't spending his lunch breaks in hotel rooms with mine. Tonight, though, I had other plans for him. I was waiting outside the bar when he stepped out, russelet slung over his shoulder, looking like a man with nothing to worry about. He didn't see me until I was right next to him. David. He froze, turned slow. Russell. I smiled. Let's talk. He glanced around, probably weighing his options, but I already knew how this would go. He wasn't the type to make a scene. That was his whole game, keeping things quiet, controlled. He wasn't going to start a fight on a sidewalk. I nodded toward his car. Take a ride with me. He hesitated, then nodded once. Smart. The drive was quiet. Lasky kept shifting in his seat, hands fidgeting against his knees. I let him sweat. The nerves were setting in, and that was exactly what I wanted. By the time we pulled up to the cabin on the outskirts of town, he was already second-guessing every decision he'd ever made. The place was old, tucked behind a thick line of trees, the kind of spot people used when they didn't want to be found. I killed the engine, stepped out, and gestured for him to follow. He swallowed hard. Why are we here? I unlocked the door, pushed it open. Inside. He hesitated again, but I just gave him a look. He stepped in. Good. The cabin was empty except for a table, a couple chairs, and a single lamp casting long shadows against the walls. I took a seat, gesturing for him to do the same. You want a drink? I asked. He shook his head. I poured one for myself, let the silence stretch. Let him feel it. Then I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. I know about the offshore accounts, I said, watching his face carefully. He flinched. Just a little. Enough. I know about the money you funneled out of your firm. The kickbacks. The shell companies. And I know that if the right people find out, you're done. His mouth opened, then closed. He was trying to keep his composure, but I could see the wheels spinning in his head. What do you want? He finally asked. I smiled. Simple. You end it with Denise. Now. Tonight. You make it clear that it's over, and you stay the hell away from me and my family. And in return, I tapped the folder sitting on the table. This never sees the light of day. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. Jesus, Russell? I tilted my head. You thought I was just gonna let this slide? He let out a slow breath, then nodded. Fine. It's done. I studied him for a second, then pushed the folder across the table. Take a look. He hesitated, then flipped it open. His face drained of what little color was left. This is everything. Sure is. He swallowed hard. If you have this, why not just go public? Why not bury me? I took a slow sip of my drink, let the whiskey burn. Because I don't need to. You were a problem. Now you're not. That's enough for me. He stared at me like he wasn't sure if he should thank me or run. I didn't give him a chance to decide. Get out. He didn't argue. Just grabbed the folder and walked out into the night, his shoulders slumped like a man who'd just been dealt the worst hand of his life. I stayed in that cabin for a while, letting the quiet settle in. Lasky was taken care of. That was step 1. Step 2? That was for Denise. And she wasn't going to see it coming. I let Lasky drive off into the night, probably straight to whatever sorry excuse for a home he had. He'd make the call to Denise, cut it clean like I told him to. A man like him wasn't about to risk everything for her. He was a survivor, just like me, and survivors know when to fold. That was one piece of the puzzle down. Now, Denise? I wasn't looking for revenge. That's for men who let emotions get the best of them. I was looking for balance. You tip my scale, I tip yours. And Denise had tipped mine too damn far. The next morning I made sure I was sitting at the coffee shop down the street from her office before she walked in. A little hole-in-the-wall place, quiet, nothing fancy. I nursed a black coffee, reading the paper like I wasn't waiting for anything in particular. But when she walked by, I made sure she saw me. She hesitated just for a second but kept walking. I gave it a beat, then folded the paper, dropped a few bills on the table, and followed. By the time I stepped into her office, she was behind her desk, flipping through some papers like she hadn't just spent the last 10 seconds deciding whether or not to bolt. Russell, she said, barely looking up. To what do I owe the pleasure? I shut the door behind me. Lasky call you yet? She went still for just a fraction of a second before smoothing a page on her desk. I don't know what you're talking about. I smiled slow. You always were a bad liar. She exhaled through her nose, set the papers down, and folded her hands on the desk. All right. You made your point. So what now? You want an apology? You want me to grovel? I leaned back against the door, crossed my arms. I don't want anything from you, Denise. I'm just here to let you know how this is gonna go. She arched a brow. Oh, this should be good. I let the silence stretch just long enough for the tension to sink in. You're gonna pack your things, I said finally. You're gonna tell Lena you're leaving, and you're gonna do it without trying to make me the villain. Then you're gonna sign whatever papers my lawyer sends over, and you're gonna walk away clean. She let out a short, humorless laugh. And if I don't? I pushed off the door, took a slow step forward. Then I start talking. She narrowed her eyes. About what? I pulled out my phone, tapped the screen a few times, and turned it toward her. A paused video. Lasky sitting in that cabin, looking like a man who'd just seen the devil himself. Her face drained of color. You see, Denise, I said, tucking the phone back in my pocket, you weren't the only one playing games. And lucky for me, Lasky's got a lot more to lose than I do. She swallowed, jaw tightening. You wouldn't. I just smiled. She leaned back, arms crossed, staring at me like she was trying to figure out her next move. That was the thing with Denise, she always thought there was another way out, another card to play. But she was finally out of chips. After a long moment, she let out a slow breath. Fine, she said. I'll go. I nodded once. Smart. She didn't speak again. Didn't argue. Didn't ask me what I planned to tell Lena. That was the part that stung the most, not for me, but for my daughter. Denise wasn't even pretending to fight for her. I turned, opened the door, and stepped out, but before I left, I looked back. You always bet on the wrong horse, Denise. She didn't say a word. Just stared down at her desk, like maybe, just maybe, she finally understood. I didn't go straight home. Instead, I walked, let the city breathe around me, the heavy New Orleans air settling into my bones. The streets were alive like always, tourists stumbling out of bars, musicians playing for tips, the smell of fried food and bad decisions hanging in the air. I passed a man hustling 3-card Monte on the corner, his hands quick, smooth, the way my old man used to move cards across a felt table. I stopped, watched for a second. The dealer caught my eye, smirked. Think you can find the lady, boss? I smiled back, shook my head. Not tonight. He nodded, flipped the cards again, and reeled in another sucker. I walked on. When I got home, Ruby was on the couch, feet kicked up, flipping through a magazine. She glanced up as I stepped inside. So? She's leaving, I said, tossing my keys on the counter. She nodded like she'd expected it. Lena, no? Not yet. Ruby closed the magazine, stretched her arms over her head. She's gonna take it hard. I know. She's staying with us? I looked at her. Of course she is. She nodded again, satisfied. I rubbed a hand over my face, exhaled. Where is she? Upstairs. I climbed the steps slow, listening for any sign that she was awake. Her door was cracked open, the faint glow of her desk lamp spilling into the hallway. I knocked twice, then pushed it open. Lena was curled up in the chair by the window, legs tucked under her, staring at nothing. She didn't look at me when she spoke. I already know. I sighed, stepped inside. Yeah? She nodded. Mom came by earlier. Told me she was leaving. I waited. Let the silence stretch, let her decide what she wanted to say. Finally, she turned to me. She didn't even try to explain. I pulled out the chair from her desk, sat down. Would it have mattered? She shrugged, staring down at the blanket draped over her knees. I don't know. She let out a breath, shaking her head. She barely even looked sad, Dad. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. You want the truth? She nodded. She's been gone for a long time, kid. This was just the first time you saw it. Her throat bobbed, but she didn't cry. She was too much like me for that. Instead, she lifted her chin, set her jaw. Good, she said finally. Then we don't need her. I didn't say anything. Just reached over, squeezed her hand once, then stood up. You need anything? She shook her head. I'm good. I started to step out but her voice stopped me. Dad? I turned. You don't have to pretend like you're fine. I smiled, small, tired. Neither do you. She held my gaze, then nodded once, just a little, before turning back to the window. I closed the door behind me, leaned against it for a second, let out a slow breath. Denise was out of our lives. That was the good part. The bad part? I wasn't done dealing with the consequences yet. A few weeks passed and life settled into a new rhythm. Denise was gone, just a name in old paperwork and a ghost in the empty side of the closet. Lena didn't talk about her much and I didn't press. She was figuring out how to deal with it in her own way. Ruby, on the other hand, didn't waste time pretending to care. One night over dinner, she casually asked if we should celebrate the upgrade and Lena cracked a smile for the first time in days. Work kept me busy. The game ran smooth, money came in, and the right people stayed happy. Business was good and for the first time in a long time, my head was clear. No distractions. No wondering what Denise was up to or where she was spending her nights. I slept better. Drank less. Even started thinking about taking Lena and Ruby on a trip somewhere, maybe the Florida coast, let them breathe a little. Then Evelyn Pierce walked in. She was sharp. Smart eyes, measured smile. Walked into my club like she already knew the room. She played a couple hands, didn't lose much, didn't win much, just watched. That was the first thing I noticed, she was watching. She played it casual, made conversation. I matched her because that's what I do. She asked about the place, about the game, about the people who played there. Slipped in a couple questions that felt just a little too careful. But she was good. Good enough that I let myself be interested. For the first time in a long time, I let my guard down. It wasn't anything serious, just a few nights, a few drinks, a few quiet conversations on the balcony outside my office while the city hummed below. She listened like she actually wanted to know things, and maybe that's what got me. Not a lot of people ask me real questions. Then, one night, she was gone. No call. No text. Just vanished. And the next morning I found out why. Ruby was the one who told me. She dropped a file onto the bar, slid it toward me without a word. I picked it up, flipped it open. And there she was. Evelyn Pierce. Undercover investigator. The report was clipped, professional. Surveillance, suspected illegal gambling operation, high-stakes game, known associates. A neat little package of everything I'd built, wrapped up and delivered to the right people. I stared at the page for a long time. Long enough for Ruby to speak first. She played you. I let out a breath, leaned back against the counter. Yeah. Lena walked in, took one look at my face, then at Ruby, then at the file on the bar. She didn't ask. She didn't have to. Ruby crossed her arms. What now? I closed the file, slid it back toward her. Now? I let out a slow breath. Now we do what we always do. Lena tilted her head. And what's that? I pushed off the counter, grabbed my coat. We play the next hand. A few months passed. Things changed, but not in ways you'd notice if you weren't paying attention. The club kept running. The money kept flowing. Lena and Ruby went on with their lives, school, friends, their usual sharp comments at the dinner table. But me? I got smarter. Meaner. Less trusting. Evelyn was gone, just like Denise. One by choice, one by consequence. I didn't chase either of them. Denise had been a mistake. Evelyn had been a lesson. You get played once, that's on them. You get played twice, that's on you. I wasn't in the habit of making the same mistake twice. Lasky left town. Quietly. I didn't need to press him, he knew better. Men like him don't take risks when they know what's waiting on the other side. As for Denise, last I heard, she was struggling to keep up with bills. Whatever golden future she thought she had with Lasky was gone before it started. No family, no safety net, just a middle-aged woman trying to rebuild a life she burned to the ground with her own hands. I didn't feel sorry for her. One night, after locking up the club, I sat on the balcony with a glass of whiskey, listening to the hum of the city. Ruby stepped out, lit a cigarette, leaned against the railing. You ever gonna talk about it? She asked. I smirked, took a sip. Talk about what? She exhaled smoke, gave me a sideways glance. The whole Evelyn thing. The fact that she was investigating you. The fact that you let her get that close. I rolled the glass between my fingers, watching the ice shift. Nothing to talk about. She did her job. I did mine. You liked her. I let out a short laugh. Sure. And I like a good whiskey. Doesn't mean I trust the bottle not to be poisoned. Ruby shook her head. You know, not every woman in your life is trying to screw you over. I gave her a look. The last two were. She shrugged. Maybe you just have shit taste. I chuckled, shook my head, took another sip. She flicked ash off the balcony. So what's next? Same as always. Keep the game running. Keep the family straight. Keep the cops out of my business. She studied me, then nodded. All right. Just don't go soft. I smirked. Not a chance. She flicked her cigarette into the street below and headed back inside, leaving me alone with the city. I sat there for a while, letting the night settle. The way I saw it, life was just a long game and I was still at the table. The cards kept coming, the bets kept raising, but I wasn't about to fold. I finished my drink, stood up, and straightened my coat. Time to deal the next hand.